Hello, today is June 12th, 2015. We're meeting today with Miss Harriet Martin in Loveland, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Harriet, and thanks for sitting down today to tell your story.
Okay.
Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
All right. Well, I was born in Minnesota in a very small town called Villard. Just a few hundred people there. And I have two older brothers. I was the youngest of everyone, all my cousins and everybody, so I was spoiled rotten. Uh, and let's see, we lived in this small town till I was about 7. Then we moved to a farm. I was never a very good farm girl. Was anxious to get away. So when I graduated from high school, I went down to Minneapolis, and the Depression came along, so my father could not afford to send me to a 4-year college, which is what I wanted to do. I love school, and wanted to be a librarian, surrounded by books, because I loved to read even then. And so he sent me to a 1-year business college, and he said if I really wanted to go to a 4-year college, I could work my way through after I had a business college. So I did the 1-year business college. Then I worked for Land O'Lakes, and I was secretary to the assistant treasurer of Land O'Lakes. But the 4-year didn't happen then because the World War II came along.
Well, let me back up and ask a couple questions. What's your date of birth?
Oh, I forgot. June 1, 1923.
Wow, I just had a birthday.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. Good birthday.
So, and then what year did you graduate from high school?
1940.
40, okay.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about, I'm always curious with your generation, what it was like going through the Depression and what that was, how that affected you. You said it was hard financially for your family. They couldn't afford to send you to college. What were those years like?
But we were really, shall I say, very blessed because we were not destitute at all. My grandfather and my father ran the grocery store in town, so we had always had food and never was hungry or anything like that. But we had my grandfather had the first bathroom in the town.
Wow.
And we kept the teachers because we were the only, or my grandfather, that is, kept the teachers. We were the only house that had a bathroom. So the teachers stayed with them. And we were, in thinking of a small town, but we were the best off financially in the town.
Right.
So although we didn't have college money, we were never destitute at all, and didn't really suffer that way. My father was not well, and mainly because he drank too much. Not drinking alcohol at all. We were Plymouth Brethren, very strict, but he drank coffee, and he ruined his health with coffee, and had got ulcers and so forth in his stomach from coffee. So the doctor told him he had to get out of the store because he drank coffee with everybody that came in.
Okay.
So we bought a farm, and that's how we got to be on the farm.
Okay.
My father knew nothing about farming, never farmed. He always sold. He was a salesman, and he sold to, he'd go out and see what the farmers needed. Then he'd go to the farm implement store and say, if I sell that for you, will you give me a commission? And they'd say yes, of course. And so then he'd go back and sell it to the farmer and get a commission. And so my two brothers, who were 5 and 10 years older than I was, became farmers.
Okay.
But they worked the farm. My father never did. And Mother and I were not farm people. We never worked outside. We still worked in, we cooked and did the housework, but never did anything outside. But since I was the youngest, I played outside. They would go out on the hay rack. I would ride along and play, but I never worked.
Okay.
So it was a good childhood.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned that your grandfather kept all the school teachers. Did that influence you into wanting to become?
Oh, sure it did, because they spoiled me. School was easy for me. I was not well as I was a young, really baby type child, and they took me to Minneapolis and so forth, and then they suggested I go to school. Well, we didn't have a kindergarten, so in the middle of the year they put me in first grade.
Wow. But
I loved it, and I went to school, and then I came home and played school. And so they had said, well, you can go and just sort of let her sit there, But I learned, and by the end of the first grade, they said, she knows as much as anybody else does. And so I went into second grade.
Wow.
So I was always the youngest in my class, but it was easy for me, mainly because I learned to read so early, and I loved to read. So if you like to read, you like school,
Right.
And so then I really had a very good childhood.
It sounds like it.
Spoiled rotten.
Yeah.
Which I liked.
Well, let's move ahead now. We were talking, the 4-year college thing fell apart because World War II broke out. Take your story from there now.
Okay. So we were all very patriotic, and it was I don't like to use the word popular, but it was we were all behind going into the war and so forth. Well, the women had to be at least 20 to join. So on my 20th birthday, I went down to join the Waves. The problem was when I got there, they said, we are just beginning this new group. And of course, we all knew that the Japanese were going to invade the West Coast. I mean, we thought we did at that time.
Yeah.
So they said the West Coast needs to be guarded. So we're starting this one with the Coast Guard, just beginning the women coming in. And they said it's going to be much smaller than the Waves. It's going to be rather elite, and if you'd like to, you could enlist in that. And so I became a spar, and I was sent first. My training was in Palm Beach, Florida.
Now, you say SPAR. What does that stand for?
Doesn't stand for anything.
Oh, okay.
A spar. You're not a good Navy man, are you? A spar is the. See, it's been so long, I can't remember the right wording either. But it's the. What is a pole on a ship?
The mast?
Yeah, it's the main mast on a ship.
Okay.
And so we were called spars.
Oh, okay.
And they used to tease us because they said, well, it's the mast that sailors hang on to in storms. So I went to Florida, and it really was very elite. We lived in hotels. We didn't live in barracks with lots of women all over everywhere. But we did have they took out the fancy furniture and put in bunk beds. So we had 4 to a room, but we had a bathroom, you see, for every 4 girls. And we were very elite. We had, uh, so there I got spoiled there too, I guess.
And how was that transition for you going, one, from civilian life into military life, and two, leaving the upper Midwest to tropical Florida?
Oh, I loved the Florida. Oh, yes. Even then I didn't like snow. Get away from the snow. Um, the first part, I've always been an easy adjuster. I adjust easily, and um, so I can't remember that it was at all difficult. Uh, Maybe because that first, when I first got to Florida, it was also new, completely different than I
Sure.
was used to. So that was interesting. And then I got to be a platoon leader. So, and they had to live with the way I did things. uh, so, like, I was the boss over my little platoon, and I don't remember having a trouble adjusting at all.
Okay.
Uh, and then I went to, I was already a secretary, but I became a yeoman, which is, Navy language for a secretary. So I could have gone to Washington, D.C., or I could go to California for my regular duty.
They gave you that choice?
I
Okay.
had that choice. And I thought California would be just like Florida, and I loved Florida. So I said, oh, I'll go to California. I said San Francisco, but I didn't get San Francisco. I was sent to Long Beach, which is the 11th Naval District, and it was not at all like Florida, which, it was not as tropical as Florida. So at first I was disappointed. Oh, this isn't right, but I learned to love it. Stayed there all the rest of the year of the service. I was in Long Beach and lived, like I said, in a hotel right on the beach. So we walked out of our hotel, we were on the beach.
Yeah.
It was great. I was in intelligence, which was very interesting. And of course, I was not an agent, but I typed up all the reports of
right.
the agents.
Oh, wow.
So I got to read them all. And
now, when you talk intelligence, were you talking about not spying, but checking out people on the West Coast, particularly like the Japanese Americans, and were you worried about spies?
Yes, that's what it was.
Okay.
And very often, lots of it was boring. I mean, if they would think that there was a Japanese group starting, and then they would go around and get all the license plates of the cars that were in, say, 2 blocks away, and then if you found them very often, then you would start watching that person.
Gotcha.
And so that part of it was maybe boring, and we got to be good friends with the agents. We dated them. We had parties with them. I feel guilty saying I had such a good war.
Yeah.
And that's not very often. But I was never in any danger,
Right. Right.
and really had a good time. I also met my husband, which helped, of course.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, how that came together.
Are you sure you want to know? It's weird. First I met this man who was a navigator in the Air Force, well, we didn't have Air Force,
Army Air Corps.
in the part, the Air Force that there was. And his father had invented something, and I don't remember what. Anyway, it was very successful, and they made a lot of money, so he was well-to-do on his own family back home. And he spent money on me, which I was, from Minnesota farm. It was a long ways up. And he always rented a car when we went on dates, which is nothing nowadays.
Yeah.
But back then it was really big. And we went to all the fancy places in Hollywood.
Wow.
And I was very enthralled with all this. So when he asked me to marry him, I said yes. And I think mostly it was probably because of money.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was quite enthused. And then he was transferred to Texas, and we agreed that because of our circumstances, we would still go on fun dates, but we would always tell him that we were engaged to somebody else, and it had to be just fun.
Mm-hmm.
So along comes this broke sailor who never has any money at all, but is funny, and we walk a lot and get to really know each other really well, because he never had any money to go anywhere, so we walked and talked and laughed, and so then, I don't know, you want anything spiritual in here?
This is your tape.
All right.
Yeah.
So, one night I always went for my devotions up on the roof, because even though it was fancier than waves, but you weren't really alone. You did have 3 roommates all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go up on the roof for my devotions. And one night while I was up on the roof, I say the Lord spoke to me, but I didn't hear a little voice or anything like that. But the conviction just convicted me in my heart that I should not marry Bruce, and I should marry Bob, who was this little sailor. And I forgot, he'd been transferred too, and I didn't have a clue where he was. His ship went out.
Oh, boy.
And we didn't have anything, but it just became so clear to me that I went downstairs and said, I'm going to write a letter and break my engagement. And they said, what? And I said, well, I know, but I think I shouldn't marry him. I should marry Bob. And they said, you don't know where Bob is. You don't ever expect to see him again. And I said, I know, but I think I will. And so I did that. And then I sat back and waited for Bob to appear, which he didn't appear until the war ended.
Wow.
And then when the war ended...
How long of a gap time period was roughly?
Not long. I was only in for, 2.5 years. So months, thinking months. And the war ended, and then he came back, not really to be with me at all, because he knew I was going to marry somebody else.
Yeah, right.
But he said, I know you'll be getting out of the service and going back to the East Coast to marry Bruce. So I thought I would tell you that I just hoped you'd be very happy and you'd, have a good life. And so I said, well, I broke my engagement to Bruce, and to be truthful, I feel like the Lord said I should marry you. And he didn't seem to be against that very much. So in 2 months we were married.
Wow.
And our wedding, it was a real funny. I mean, our life together has been funny. We have just had such a good life. But anyway, I'm not telling all of that, but we did get married, and then he had just re-enlisted before the war ended to get some money, And so he still had 2 years, and I got out right after we were married. So I went back to Minnesota, and his ship went out again, and he thought it was going to come back into the West Coast, but instead of that, it went all the way around to the East Coast. And when he went through Panama, he thought, "Oh, this is nice." He liked that, so he put in for a transfer to Panama, and he got it. So he was in Panama, so he called me and said, "Why don't you come down to Panama? We'll be here at least a year till I get out." And so I went down to Panama, and down there I got a job as the secretary to the president of the railroad company. And he was in charge of the whole canal zone.
Wow.
So his regular secretary, they hadn't been able to take a vacation, so she had lots of vacation time piled up. So I took her place, and it was a very elite job, believe me. He said, "Now when I want you, I want you right now. I don't want you saying, well, I'll come in 5 minutes." So whenever he did not want me, I read books. So I sat and read a book until he wanted me, and then I jumped. But also, it was sort of an elite job. Like if I needed a pencil sharpener, I didn't get up and sharpen my pencil. I tapped a little bell that was on my desk, and a little Panamanian boy came up and got my pencil and sharpened it and brought it back to me.
Wow.
So it was a real special job. It really was. And I had that all the time for the year. We loved it down there.
I was going to say, if you loved Florida, I assume you must have loved the tropics of Panama.
Yes, yeah. I've always loved the tropics, and I end up in Colorado. But anyway, so we stayed there. But Bob could have been discharged down there and gotten a job on going across the canal, because and I had this really nice job, so we thought of staying. We said, well, we'll stay, say, 10 years, then we'll go home, and we'll have all this money piled up, because they paid really good, and of course the government. And then people that lived there that had done that said, don't do that. You will be so sorry. They said, we get afraid to go home. We don't stay 5 years and go home, or 10 years. We get afraid of the competition that's home, and we think we couldn't handle it. So we end up spending our whole life down here until we retire. They said, don't do that. Go home now while you're young and you're not afraid of what's up there. And so we went home, and we were both going to go to school on, I was going to get my 4-year college in
Take advantage
on
of the
GI Bill.
Okay.
And we both have the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And so we, home being Northern California, around the San Jose area.
Where was Bob? Bob was from that area?
Bob he lived in Los Gatos, which is just out of San Jose.
Okay.
And had 4 brothers, one of 5, of a destitute family. Really, the father had become a hobo during the Depression. The mother was left with these 5 kids, and was a stern old German who would not take help. They could starve rather than take welfare, believe me. But they didn't. All the boys worked and so forth, and they made it. Anyhow, when we got there, we were walking down to register to go to college, both of us at San Jose State. And we walked by an employment agency. I said, you know, it would sure be a lot easier if I worked. You went to college, and then when you get out of college, then I will go to college. And he said, well, let's go see what there is, see if there's anything interesting. Well, of course, there was something very interesting. And I got a job at the mental hospital. And I was the staff secretary, which was fascinating. All morning long, I took uh, dictation. Well, not really dictation, but the the doctors would interview patients when they came in, or when they were diagnosed, or when they went out. They would all have to be interviewed by a group of doctors, and I took the notes from all of those all morning. And then in the afternoon I transcribed them. So I got to be a real doctor. I could diagnose a patient as good as they could. And I did that for all the Bob worked. Bob went to school all year round, so 3 years. And I worked those 3 years. But then I was supposed to go to college, and instead of that, I got pregnant. And we had Callie, which is the gal that you met over here, who was our first child. And I was sick. I do not do pregnancy well. Believe me, I laid in bed for 7 months and couldn't get out of bed without vomiting and so forth and so on. So that was a pretty horrible time, but we survived. And then, so about the time we had her, Bob graduated and became a history teacher, and was a history teacher. And then a couple years, more than that, because Callie was 7. So 7 years later, we had a missionary from our church stayed with us while they were speaking at our church. And they were recruiting for teachers for a MK school in the Philippines, which was just beginning. And it was Faith Academy. And both Bob and I got really excited. Oh, we could go live in the Philippines. And the day that the mission was coming to interview us for us to go, and I was getting dressed, ready to go to the airport to pick him up and bring him home to interview us, I heard this bump in the hall and rushed out, and Callie was having a seizure. Grand mal seizure, scary as everything if you've never seen anything like it, you know. And I just picked her up and carried her, ran to the doctor's office, which was only about 2 blocks away. But I just carried her in, and she was in the hospital for 5 days, and they couldn't see any reason for it. But the mission refused to send us. They said, oh, we can't send somebody to a third world with a ill child that we don't know what it is. And so that was the end of that little dream. And we stayed in California teaching, and then Bob worked his way up. And we had 2 more kids, so we ended up with 3, Callie and 2 boys. And we stayed there until, let's see, the last kid was graduating from college. And Bob said, you know, we have all these friends in Africa who are at an MK school over there. And I could take early retirement. We were still only in our 50s. He said, I'll take early retirement and we'll go to Africa. Well, believe me, Africa did not sound good to me. I mean, we had a nice home, we had our friends, we had everything, and I did not want to go to Africa. So I didn't say I wouldn't go, but I didn't really cooperate very well. And uh, so we were sort of at that spot when one day I got a telephone call from the mission, and it said, uh, next year the Faith Academy in the Philippines needs a high school counselor, which is what Bob was by that time.
Okay.
And I thought, well, Lord, if you will now let us go to Faith Academy, which we wanted to go to 30 years before and couldn't, then I guess that's saying, okay, you should go. So I stopped being a little hard to get along with, and we went. We were there 6 years.
In the Philippines?
In the Philippines, yeah. And we loved that. I loved the weather and the school. The only thing I didn't love was home type. We had to have a house girl, which for me was really hard. I mean, I'd been doing it my way for all these years, and it was really hard to do it her way when it was not my way. But we survived, and we were, like I say, there for 6 years. Then we came back from there, and we were visiting friends in Southern California, and they lived in this place called Leisure World, which was a community of about 20,000 people at that time, which was all seniors. And they had everything. They had, let me see, 4 swimming pools, 2 gyms, golf courses, everything for seniors. And they said, you should come here. And I said, oh, we can't afford this. We're on a teacher's retirement. And they said, it's cheaper than you think. You should try it. And so actually we did. We lived there for 20 years.
Wow.
And we both loved it. It was wonderful. After 20 years, there was a little problem that came in. My husband got a dementia, and was actually started getting it just as we were leaving the Philippines. So, but that was real good because they did everything for us. They maintained it so we didn't have to, and it was good for Bob to be there. He was a tennis player, so he could go play tennis, and then it got worse and worse, and he'd get lost and so forth and so on. So when Callie and Bob were in Oregon working for GE, and they got transferred out here. So she called and she said, Mom, why don't you and Dad come and we'll look for a bigger house that Bob can make an apartment for you in, and you and Dad can come and live with us out there. And I said, oh, honey, we can't live together. We're too different. And she said, by the grace of God, we'll do it, Mom. And so we came and found this spot. And I do have an apartment. I have this room, I have a bathroom, I have a laundry, and I have a bedroom. And I have my own private door over here. And so now we've been here for 13 years. And that's my life story. Oh, Bob passed away in 07. And I really thought that I would go right away because by that time I felt that the Lord had left me here to take care of Bob. And when I didn't need to take care of him, I would go to heaven too. The problem is he left and I didn't. So I'm still here.
How many years were you and Bob married then?
62.
60, wow.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that you wanted to tell his story as well, his wartime story. Do you want to tell that?
Yeah. I can. It's much more interesting than mine. like I said, even when he enlisted, he didn't go down to enlist. As I said, he was one of 5 boys, and one of the other boys decided they would enlist in the Navy, and 4 boys were over 6 foot, and Bob was 5'7", little kid, and they said, "Oh, well, you never get in, you're too little," and so forth and so on. So they went to San Francisco. They lived in San Jose,
Mm-hmm.
or Los Gatos, which is right out of San Jose. And so they went, this other boy went to enlist, and the brothers went with him. And they teased Bob so much about being little and scrawny and so forth and so on. So he took the exam. He passed and the other kid didn't. So he was in the Navy. So that was in May of 41. So the war had,
before the war. Okay,
yeah,
pre-war. Okay.
hadn't even started. So at the time of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, he was home on leave. But of course they called him back immediately. Yeah. And by the 17th, in 10 days, he was at Pearl Harbor. So he wasn't there for the bombing, but he was there for the devastation.
Right, yeah.
And he saw all that devastation. He put in for lighter than air. He got submarines, the opposite. So he was a submariner.
Oh, wow.
And got to be a quartermaster first class. And they had, his stories of the submarine are really, like, they were the first ones into Sea of Japan, and they got in, and there were just the Japanese ships just sitting around for them to torpedo. They had more trouble getting out than they had going in. They ended up going underneath a Japanese ship, and so nobody could hear them because they were way down low underneath, and they stuck out without getting hurt. And many other stories like that, which were really very interesting. But his mother had the 5 boys, all went into the Navy, and none of them were hurt in any way. They all came home, yeah. And so,
and particularly Bob, I mean, the submarine service, that was probably the most dangerous service anyone could be in during the war. I mean, the casualty rate was...
Yeah, he always said he was very calm and quiet. He had to be to put up with me. And so you had to be that to be a submariner. He said we'd be in the ship underneath, and they would be depth bombing us, and we could hear the boats or so forth that held the ship together. They could hear them popping and would wonder which one will pop and we won't be able to get up again. In fact, one of his stories was when they were down, and there was a Japanese ship above them that knew they were down there, and finally they were running out of battery power, so they were going to have to go up, and the captain said, "Well, now be prepared. We're going up, and we know the enemy is up there, and we're just going to fight it out." They went up, and this is another God thing. It was so foggy. The fog was just layered over them, and they just went up and snuck away in the fog. And so he has a lot of good submarine stories, But anyway, so that's sort of...
Do you remember where you were on December 7th and what you were thinking when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Oh, on Pearl Harbor, December, yeah. I was working for Land O'Lakes then, and I was living in a women's dormitory, and it came over on, I was getting ready to go to church. It was a Sunday morning, and it came on the radio about Pearl Harbor. And of course, we were all shocked, I guess. I must have been 19. I wasn't 20 yet, because I couldn't join right away. So I was 19. But I called my boyfriend at that time and said, "Are you enlisting?" And he said, "Sure." So he enlisted right away. I never did marry him, but I still hear from him occasionally.
Is that right?
Yeah, email. Yeah.
Now, did either one of your brothers enlist, or were they too old?
Yeah, no. My oldest brother actually enlisted. They both wanted to go, but they were farmers,
okay.
and they wouldn't take both of them, so only one got to go. And it was, the other one really resented it. Yeah, because the oldest one left, and the second one stayed on the farm. And although they worked together for years, but underneath it bothered him.
Sure.
He didn't get to go, you know.
Right.
And two of us went and enlisted, and he didn't get to.
What were your parents' thoughts about you enlisting? Did they have any qualms with that?
I can remember my dad. I remember my Aunt Lola, who was in Minneapolis, and she said, "Bert will never let you go." But when I went home and told him, they were, of course, see, we were so pro-war at that war. And then he said, "Okay," but he said, "Remember, you're a Christian, and you can be a Christian wherever you go." And so, no, they didn't argue at all, even though people thought they would.
And how was it? I mean, you were kind of a trailblazer. I mean, women...
I was like the second unit going into like Palm Beach, I mean, as a spar. They hadn't even taken down the fancy furniture yet in Palm Beach when I got there. So I was a trailblazer. But that was didn't bother me any.
But you didn't
Uh,
run into trouble, I mean, being a woman, I mean, discrimination, particularly in the military.
People, you know, I don't remember back then. I don't remember any problems. I can remember some of the drill masters saying, "You Utes of America," you were from New York, you know.
Okay,
and they screamed at us and gave us a hard time. But I think they thought that was their job, you know, toughen us up. And I didn't have any problem with the men that I worked with. They were all very gentlemen. Of course, I was pretty,
feisty?
Basic, yeah, right. I wasn't the flirty type.
Oh, okay.
I just don't remember having a hard time working with them. They were very cooperative. They seemed to appreciate us women coming in and helping. We had two men worked in our office. Like I say, they were very respectful of us. I don't remember any problems, really. There must have been some, I suppose, but if they did, they floated over my head.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, as well, in comparison to today, I mean, your options were limited as a woman back then. Is that correct? I mean, as far as career-wise, and then in the military, I'm assuming you were only.
Yeah. Well, we had, as women, we had truck drivers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Not necessarily the mechanics.
Yeah.
But driving truck. We had truck drivers. We had people that worked like in the kitchen and that kind. Lots of secretaries. Of course, see now, I lived in the hotel. I worked in an office building downtown. The intelligence had one floor in an office building. The other floors were civilian people. So I just really lived it up. Yeah.
Uh, did you fall under any sort of scrutinization? I know talking to other people that were in intelligence roles, the FBI would go back and investigate their
Oh yes, I had to be investigated by the FBI to get in. I had high, what is it when you're qualified to handle secret stuff?
clearance.
Clearance. I had high clearance.
Really?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I did. And I remember when my mother wrote and said, there was a man around asking all kinds of questions about you and all that, you know, and I said, yeah, Mom, I have to be qualified to to do my job. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, so
Oh, that must have been just fascinating.
it was.
What
I
you were,
said
you were in
I've
the
had
middle.
the
You were in the
best
thick of it.
life you can believe.
Yeah.
I've been so blessed. Yeah. And now you can see the kids are really good to me, and I don't drive anymore, which is tough. But you adjust. You have to adjust to life if whatever it brings, and they really are really good. I have a good church, and I have friends, and yeah, yeah.
Through the years, have you kept in touch with any of the people you served with, or any sort of reunions of you?
I've never been to a reunion. Oh, once. There was one reunion of the Spars in San Francisco while I lived in California, and Bob took me up. It was really disappointing. I didn't see anybody that I had known
Oh, wow.
before. They were all strangers, and although, of course, we talked to each other, but it wasn't like you went
Right.
and, oh, I seen you.
Yeah, right.
There's one girl, she was a good friend of mine in the Spars. She is still living. She lives in Washington, and Bob and I used to travel every summer back to Minnesota to see my family, and lots of times we'd go up to Washington and then cut across up north,
Oh, okay.
and so I've seen her over the years, and we still like send Christmas cards, and so we know we're still alive. And this year I did not get one from her,
Oh boy.
and so I'm afraid she's gone. Yeah.
Right. Right.
But until then, I did keep in touch with. She was my maid of honor at my quote wedding. There were only like 8 of us there, so not too hard to keep track.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, until I sat down to interview, I'd never heard of your unit before. I mean, the woman's
Of spars.
the spars in the Coast Guard.
No, everybody says, and what is a spar?
Yeah.
Even the veterans
Yeah.
don't know what the spars are. They were disbanded. In fact, I have my scrapbook from back then, and yesterday I was going through it again after many years of not, and I found a little thing that I had cut out of a newspaper that the Coast Guard was disbanding the spars and not recruiting anymore, and that was near the end of the war. Yeah.
So you really would had say you wanted to make a career out of it. You really had no option. You were being disbanded and no option of re-enlisting then.
No, I could have stayed in. In fact, I was a yeoman first class. I could have stayed in, which my friend did, and been a chief yeoman and closed the place down, closed the spars down. But I got out because I got married.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she was in for maybe another 6 months or so, and then she came out as a chief. So I don't know what that advantage is because we weren't in long enough to get retirement or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Well, as we start to close down this interview, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about, or any of the stories that kind of floated to the top? And Callie, jump in if there's anything she's left out that ideally, I know we only probably got the tip of the iceberg of your story, but ideally covered most of it. Or do you think we covered everything?
What do you think, honey? I, I have so many funny stories that have happened during 90 some years of living.
That was interesting.
That, but we don't have time to tell all the funny little things that the kids hear about.
Yeah. I didn't listen to everything because I didn't want to be making noises in there of clunky things.
Yeah,
Um,
but so.
Well, the one question I always like to ask at the end of these interviews, how do you think that time period, your service in the Coast Guard, the war years, how did that play a role in your life, affect your life, change your life, or did it? Or was it, do you look at it as just simply a chapter in your life? How would you?
Well, of course, it completely changed my life. I left Minnesota, never to go back. Lived what I call my life in California.
yeah,
If-
everything changed.
Yeah, everything changed. Yeah, completely. Right.
Very
Yeah.
good.
So, like I say, I've had the Lord has given me such a blessed,
Oh,
fun life.
It sounds like
Bob
that.
and I laughed through the whole thing. More funny things happened, in the Philippines, in Panama. Just a good life.
Yeah.
It really has been. Yeah.
And it sounds like the two main components of that good life was your religious belief and humor.
Yeah.
It's like the
right.
two things that keep popping up.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Harriet, I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today, and just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Like I said, I'm almost feel guilty because I had a good war. And there is not such a thing as a good war. But just personally, I had good experiences all the way through the war. Yeah.
Yeah.
And think of the people that suffered through it. So I feel I was very blessed.
Well, blessed, but at the same time, you did your role. I mean, you protected the West Coast. You filled a spot for somebody that could move on and
Yeah.
serve overseas. So
And I did do that.
yeah,
But certainly the Lord was very good to me through the whole time.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you.